The great courses cover a broad array of university-level disciplines. The lectures in each course are either 30 or 45 minutes long. By listening for less than an hour a day, you can finish even the longest course in just weeks. Browse our catalog or website and imagine how much you could learn if you spent just 30 minutes a day for the next year in the best college classrooms in the world. The lecturers are university professors carefully selected by the teaching company and its customers for intellectual distinction and teaching excellence. These lectures are titled Great Battles of the Ancient World, Part 1. The lecturer is Professor Garrett Fagan. Professor Fagan is an associate professor of classics, ancient Mediterranean studies, and history at Pennsylvania State University. He received his undergraduate degree from Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, and his PhD from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. He has held teaching positions at McMaster University, York University in Canada, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Davidson College. In addition to his classroom teaching, Professor Fagan is a frequent and popular public lecturer to audiences of all ages. Professor Fagan has an extensive record in Roman history research. He has held a prestigious Killam postdoctoral fellowship at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and an Alexander von Humboldt research fellowship at the University of Cologne in Germany. He is the author of Bathing in Public in the Roman World and has published numerous articles in international journals. Additionally, Professor Fagan has edited a volume on the phenomenon of pseudo-archaeology. His current research focuses on spectatorship at the Roman arena and ancient warfare. Professor Fagan is also the lecturer for the teaching company course, The History of Ancient Rome. Professor Fagan prepared the course guide that comes with these lectures. The course guide includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, a timeline, battle plans, biographical notes, and a bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture. Lecture 1. Why Study Battles? What is War?
Hello, my name is Garrett Fagan from Penn State University, and this is the Teaching Company's course on Great Battles of the Ancient World. This is my second course with the company, and I'm delighted to be back. When considered dispassionately, the ancient battle, perhaps even more so than its modern counterpart, has a distinct miasma of derangement about it. Think about it for a minute. Many thousands of men, aged from their mid-teens to their mid-60s, would gather on a patch of ground. They would bring with them the instruments of butchery, and I mean that quite literally: knives, swords, axes, metal-tipped poles. Horses, elephants, carts, or chariots could also be present. Everyone lined up opposite each other. Rituals were performed, deities invoked, words of encouragement spoken. Then, on a given signal, the opposing lines converged, and the work of the slaughterhouse got underway. The details of what happened in these ghastly moments we will postpone for later contemplation, but they truly defy the modern imagination, Hollywood attempts at recreation notwithstanding. When it was all over, the contested field would be awash with corpses, blood, intestines, body parts, as well as writhing and wailing wounded people and animals, and discarded, broken weapons. The victors pillaged the bodies of the vanquished. The survivors then went home, most likely to fight another day, if not against this same foe, then surely against someone else. These are all facts enough to appreciate how strange the whole business of battle was, and remains still, mutatis mutandis. It's a deeply irrational, even perverse procedure. And yet, on the outcomes of such encounters, often fought over the course of a few hours, on a few square miles of land or sea, can rest the fate of entire nations, peoples, or far-flung empires. So here is a primary reason to study battles. They represent intense nodes of historical change. A good way to appreciate this is by speculating counterfactually about alternative outcomes to major battles, ancient or modern. In 334 BC, for instance, a young Macedonian king named Alexander crossed into Asia and invaded the old Persian Empire. It was an undertaking of simply mind-boggling ambition. given that the Persian realm was several orders of magnitude vaster than Alexander's modest holdings in the northern Balkans. Persian resistance was first encountered at the Granicus River in northwest Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. There, while charging into the midst of Persian cavalry, Alexander found himself isolated from his companions and surrounded by the enemy. A Persian rider shattered Alexander's helmet with an axe, or a sword in some accounts, with a blow so strong that the blade actually grazed the Macedonian's scalp. The Persian rider then prepared to deliver his killing blow. At just this moment, Alexander's friend Clytus the Black rode in and either transfixed the Persian with his lance or sliced off his striking arm at the shoulder with the sword. Again, the ancient accounts differ on this detail. Had Clytus's intervention come a split second too late, Alexander's great adventure in Asia would have come to a very abrupt end right there at the Granicus in its very first challenge. He himself, today one of the giants of history, would have been relegated to the small print, a young and inexperienced king who ruled only 2 years and perished while entertaining the monumental folly of conquering an empire so much larger than his own. Counterfactual contemplation like this serves, in my view, to demonstrate how dynamic battles are as agents of historical change, whether we like that fact or not. What would have happened if Napoleon had won at Waterloo, Lee at Gettysburg, or Hitler at Stalingrad? Or if William of Normandy had been defeated at Hastings while invading England in 1066, or Eisenhower, going in the opposite direction, tried to breach Fortress Europe in 1944? How would our lives be different today? Battles, for all their madness, are worthy of study, if for no other reason than they are the crucibles of history. I have sometimes encountered the following moral objection to the study of military matters. The study of battles and warfare promotes an unhealthy militarism, which is something that we ought to be getting away from, goes this line of thinking. I first encountered this argument some years ago when I used to subscribe to a professional e-list. The list was a very useful clearinghouse of information on any number of topics relating to the classics and ancient history. You would post a query or a comment to the list, and other professionals or graduate students would reply. It was a great way to collect all manner of material rapidly and handily. One day, a subscriber asked a question of a military nature about the great Persian invasions of Greece in 480 to 479 BC, the main battles of which we will be discussing in lectures 10, 11 and 12 of this course. Members offered helpful responses. Then, one subscriber, a relatively eminent professor in Canada, entered the fray to chastise the discussants for their military knowledge. Teaching students about warfare, he asserted, glorified a horrible process, militarized their thinking, and made them more likely to support or even engage in war when they were all grown up. He then revealed something extraordinary. He boasted that in his courses he covered the Persian Wars in about 5 minutes of one class, in order to move on to the important matters about classical Greece, the ones that really deserve study, in his opinion: the art and architecture, the civic mindedness, the glorious cultural achievements in drama, history, rhetoric, and philosophy. By teaching students about invasions and battles, we were doing them a grave disservice, he asserted. I was flabbergasted then, and thinking about it now, I'm still flabbergasted. While much could be said about this professor's position on warfare, I really felt that he was not doing his job honestly. He was presenting his students with a skewed and distorted picture of who the ancient Greeks were and what they valued. The Greek victory in the Persian Wars marked the defining moment of their ancient history, initiated the classical age, and generated the self-confidence that stood at the root of their subsequent triumphs in the cultural arenas, the things that the professor wanted to focus on. To look at the results without appreciating the causes, it seems to me, is to do history some considerable violence. Whether we like it or not, the plain fact is that war and warfare have been constant companions of European civilization since we first have written records to read. In all probability, the relationship between humans and organized intraspecies killing is a lot older than that. We do our commitment to historical truth no favors if, in the name of a misguided moralism, we close our eyes to this essential feature of the record. So let us dispense at the outset with the specious argument that the study of war promotes militarism and killing. To reiterate, whether we approve of it or not, the societies of the ancient Mediterranean basin placed a premium on warfare in practically all areas of endeavor, in the religious, political, social, and ideological spheres. They Ignoring or downplaying that fact risks serious distortion in the study of antiquity. Let us stay with the Greeks as an example. While they weren't militaristic in a modern totalitarian sense like the Nazis or Red Russia, they were certainly very warlike. The men of Greece in no small measure calibrated a man's worth against his performance in battle. So much of their mythology, their art, or their literature was focused on warfare and explored its consequences and morality. Athletics, a defining feature of Greek culture, was primarily seen as a good way to train for war. Among the Greeks themselves, one of the most admired Greek city-states was Sparta, which was also the most warlike of the lot. The Athenians, for all their cultural achievements, were almost constantly engaged in wars for most of the 5th and the 4th centuries BC. They projected their military power across the Aegean, south to Egypt, and east to Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And as we shall see in Lecture 13, they even made an attempt on Sicily to the west. This was democratic Athens, home of Euripides, Sophocles, of Thucydides and Socrates, and it was all war all the time. The same is true, even more so, for Pharaonic Egypt, the Assyrian Empire in the Near East, or for ancient Rome. Warfare was central to the ideology of these states, central to the lives of their elites, and central to the experience of the commons. Warfare, indeed, was central to the historical experience and to the development of the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Now, war as a phenomenon can be studied from a variety of angles, but considering warfare without considering battles is like doing theology without mentioning God. Combat is the core of war, the point of the whole endeavour. As we shall examine in more detail in the next lecture, warfare has been with us for a very long time. In my opinion, we turn a blind eye to the study of it at our own peril. Rather, it is a process that demands understanding, and of all the aspects of war that are the most pressing, battle is Exhibit A. For whatever about the ideological, social, religious, or cultural aspects of war, which are all subjects eminently worthy of study, warfare ultimately boils down to people killing other people. Without that organized lethality, there is no war to speak of. And the battle, of course, is where the killing gets done. Battle, therefore, is the essence of war, reduced to its purest form. The heart and soul of war, the raison d'etre for all those other things that accrue to war. Those things which facilitate battle. The logistics, the ideology, the value system, the propaganda, the economic preparations, whatever they may be. All of these aspects of war, I repeat, each worthy of research, are really secondary to the brutal business of the battle. As such, battles are often the most direct avenue into the dark heart of human warfare. So much then for justification. Now to the parameters of this course. Our chronological limits stretch from prehistory down to the later Roman Empire. We shall begin with the period before there were humans at all. After considering the issue of what war is, we initially examined the prehistoric roots of warfare and discussed the various scholarly and methodological problems of investigating it. Then we proceed in more or less diachronic order to the warfare of ancient Sumer and Egypt, then the Assyrians, and on to the Greeks and Romans. The last battle that concerns us took place in the 4th century AD, and we conclude with reflections on the prominence of warfare in the ancient Mediterranean world, as well as some discussion about its nature and perhaps the inheritance that it offers us in the modern world. Throughout, our primary focus is on land warfare as we survey both battles in the open field and sieges, but we do not ignore or overlook naval warfare entirely. The focus of the course is firmly on the ancient Mediterranean world. For those wishing to learn about Chinese or Mayan or Aztec warfare, there is not much on offer in what follows. The reason for this is simple. My expertise lies in the ancient Mediterranean, and I am not in a position to speak with any authority about military developments outside that cultural sphere. A teacher, like a good general, ought to know his limitations, and I freely acknowledge mine. In the course of our journey, we survey numerous accounts of individual battles. But we do much more than that as well. Along the way, we will study how military tactics, techniques, organization, weaponry, and other aspects of warfare evolved over the ages. Points of contention between scholars, or often competing camps of scholarly opinion, are outlined and discussed as we proceed. It needs to be stated at the outset that the study of war is so multifaceted that it is impossible to give every aspect of each topic its full due. But it is my modest hope that the audience will at least gain an acquaintance not just with the details of specific engagements, but also with the wider debates that those engagements elicit. The battle narrative first appears with the Greeks. By battle narrative, I mean an account of proceedings that includes some indication of what actually transpired while the issue was still in doubt. Ideally, we would hear about initial troop deployments, unit movements and maneuvers, and the course of the fighting itself. Prior to the Greeks, as we shall be seeing, battles are alluded to more than they are described. In Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Assyrian accounts, for instance, the focus tends to be on the butchery of the defeated enemy as they flee for their lives. The actual fighting is often glossed over in a single sentence or in very vague phrases. So although the oldest records of battles go back to the 3rd millennium BC, 5,000 years ago, it is often very difficult to reconstruct what we might term the mechanics of combat for these very early eras. This leaves plenty of scope for scholarly interpretation, and so for disagreement, scholarly battles if you will, as we shall see soon enough. The genre of the great battle has a long and august pedigree, but historical approaches have changed significantly over the last century or more, transforming how battles are studied. The great battle genre was born in the 19th century, but it was manifested largely as a sort of cheerleading exercise for the triumph of the West or the victory of civilization. Sir Edward Creasy's 1851 classic, 15 Decisive Battles of the World, is emblematic of this style. Creasy introduced the concept of the decisive battle, which stressed the outcome of an engagement as its most important feature. But there is a certain ambiguity about the concept of decisiveness. Decision can be reached at the tactical or on the strategic plane. Most battles have been tactically decisive insofar as somebody wins or loses on the day. But not all engagements settle matters at the strategic level. We shall see examples of battles later in the course that were spectacularly decisive on the tactical level, but wholly indecisive strategically. The great battle narrative in the Creasy vein also imposes an order on battles, as if they were great chess games played with human pieces. The focus is on the command decisions, and the troops behave like pawns, enacting the wishes of the planners. The tendency is exemplified in the traditional battle map, where units are arrayed in neat columns and lines, and the so-called phases of the engagement are charted on distinct plans. Now, to a degree, this format is unavoidable. Otherwise, the chaos of the battlefield would be wholly unrepresentable. So the unit-focused format has continued right down to our own day. But in all such works, there is a danger of overly schematizing the battle experience, of imposing order from above where little or none existed on the ground. John Keegan's The Face of Battle, first published in 1976, transformed how battles were studied. Keegan was critical of previous studies along the lines that I've just outlined, especially those of the Creasy variety. He emphasized the individual soldier as the human face of battle, and shifted the focus from the movement of the unit to the experience of the individual combatant, on the argument that thousands of individual decisions beyond the commanders often decided a battle's outcome. We might dub this approach experiential. Its focus was on what being in a battle was actually like and what made soldiers stay and fight rather than just run away and go home. The unit-focused and the experiential approaches can be combined very effectively, as illustrated in such excellent recent works as Anthony Beevor's Stalingrad, published in 1998. Here, the gyrations of the armies taking part in the largest land operation in history, Hitler's invasion of Russia in 1941, are skillfully analysed in conjunction with the personal experiences of the combatants, as recovered from letters home from the front, and it makes for very compelling stuff. Building on these bases, the work of Victor Davis Hanson has re-energized the great battle genre for the ancient world, but in part by using it to advocate a controversial thesis. In The Western Way of War, published in 1989, and in Carnage and Culture, published in 2001, and in some other books, Hanson follows Keegan's lead and focuses on the experiential dimension of battles. However, he ties this approach to much more sweeping claims about warfare, culture, and the Western experience as a whole. It is sufficient here to outline the main thrust of his argument, which we'll be returning to at various stages over the course of these series of lectures. According to Hanson, decisive battles originated with the Greeks in the period around 700 to 600 BC, and they are not found earlier or elsewhere. The Greeks bequeathed to the West an approach to warfare that emphasized the direct confrontation, the the bringing to bear of maximum force in a concentrated and frightful engagement. Deception, ambushes, hit-and-run fights, and other forms of deceit were to be eschewed. Hansen believes that this insistence on seeking a decisive frontal engagement is a uniquely Western trait and marks all of Western warfare right down to the present. It helps explain also why the Western way of war has proven so much more lethal than the combat techniques of other cultures. Such, at least, is Hansen's broad argument in a very distilled form, and we shall return to consider it in more detail at the appropriate places in the lectures that follow. But for the moment, it is sufficient to bear it in mind as we proceed. It must be remembered, however, that Keegan's or Hansen's approach have some severe limitations. For ancient battles where the sources are so sketchy, it is often very difficult to reconstruct the human face of battle. Most of Keegan's engagements are relatively well documented, Waterloo or the Somme, for instance. His earliest battle was Agincourt, which was fought on the 15th of October 1415. And for that, he relies less on direct testimony from the combatants, because there is none, and more on the probabilities drawn from analysis of armour and weapons, conditions on the ground, and the clash of different types of troops. This method is appropriate for ancient battles, but the sources are even sketchier for antiquity than they are for the 15th century. Our scattered ancient sources will necessarily draw on evidence from different battles fought at different times and places. Our best hope can therefore be for little more than a generalized impression of what transpired. Whether a composite picture arrived at in this way accurately reflects ancient reality in a specific instance of battle is a matter open to question. Indeed, such a composite picture risks being seriously misleading. This requires us to be very careful with the evidence and not to rush too quickly from the specific to the general. These comments pertain less to specific battles than to arguments that try to draw on broad generalizations from bits and pieces of evidence taken from different battles fought in different times and places. To close out this introductory lecture, let us now turn to the issue of what warfare actually is. People recognize war when they see it, but it has proven difficult to formulate a convincing general definition. There is something about warfare that marks it off as distinct from other forms of human communal violence, such as rioting or gang fights, and we know this almost instinctively. But can we put a finger on what that something is? Some scholars have seen human aggression as the key to war. But aggression, while certainly a requisite for war, is insufficient as an explanation for it all unto itself, since it underlies all forms of violence, most of which are not manifestly war. Wife-beating, child abuse, individual murder, mugging, all of these stem from aggression, but are not forms of war, despite glib metaphors about wars against women or wars on crime and so on. Aggression isn't enough. Perhaps the presence of multiple combatants characterizes war, but gang fights, bar fights, clan vendettas, riots, these all have multiple combatants, but they do not constitute warfare either. War clearly requires the consent of the community and prior planning. So our communal sanction and advanced planning diagnostic of war, well, capital punishment requires both, and it's not warfare either. Clearly, warfare requires all of the above elements: multiple combatants, aggression, planning, and communal consent. But in and of themselves, these things do not warfare meet, even when found in combination. Something more is needed. Identifying that missing element is the issue around which the scholarly debate about defining war circles. To gain some appreciation of the character of this debate, we shall examine two definitions of warfare. The first is what I term operational. This view, favoured by many military historians, sees warfare above all as a particular set of procedures. This approach was championed by anthropologist Harry Halbert Turney High in his 1949 book, Primitive War, Its Practice and Concepts. Turney High, who had himself served in uniform, argued that warfare is a social institution that adheres to certain near-universal principles. The most important of these principles is that of correct formations, namely the column for approach and the line for engagement. The use of tactical formations implies much about a society's complexity. It requires command and control, high levels of planning and specialization, and logistical support. Turney High regarded the use of formations as so central to warfare that he thought societies lacking them fell below what he termed the military horizon. True warfare exists only above this line. Conflicts conducted below the military horizon do not meet the basic criteria for true warfare. Such conflict Turney High termed primitive war, and I use that term in inverted commas, primitive war, and it is marked by disorganized fighting, a high degree of ritualization, reduced lethality, and the lack of clear objectives. It also has distinctly game-like qualities. Distinguishing primitive war from sport or social ritual is often very difficult. This is because, of course, in Turney High's view, it wasn't war at all. As an example of primitive war, scholars often point to the Yanomamo people of the Amazon basin, who were observed for several decades by anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon in the 1960s and onwards. The Yanomamo number about 10,000 in all, and they live in scattered villages. They fight mostly over women. Conflicts take four main forms in ascending order of lethality. First are chest-pounding duels, one-on-one between disputing parties. Each strikes the chest of the other with alternate blows until one party cannot continue. Then come club fights. Here, aggrieved parties hit each other on the head with 10-foot poles until one cannot continue. I can't imagine those fights go on for terribly long. Being hit in the head with the 10-foot pole is not something that a person is going to endure for long. Now, there is a potential during the club fights for partisans to get involved in the fight, in which case the combat escalates, but fatalities tend to be very rare even if that happens. If satisfaction has not been gained by club fights, spear fighting becomes a possibility. These encounters involve groups of aggrieved parties chasing each other with spears, and people now get killed. Finally, there are out-and-out raids and ambushes where the killing can be intense. Reciprocal raids take place between villages, and any member of an opposing village is considered a legitimate target. The ultimate type of raid is termed the dastardly trick, whereby a complicit third party invites one side of the dispute to a feast, only to have them ambushed and slaughtered at the table by their enemies who are concealed nearby. Now, the ritualized and game-like features of these conflicts well illustrate the characterizing features of Turney High's concept of primitive war. Turney High was adamant that such forms of fighting ought not to be dignified with the label warfare. Warriors are not soldiers, chiefs are not generals, and raids and ambushes are not battles. To his mind, none of these things cross the military horizon into the realm of genuine warfare, which requires tactical formations, command and control, logistical planning, and clear objectives. For Turney High and those who follow him then, warfare is really a matter of how people actually conduct fighting. In a nutshell, warfare is as warfare does. This is the essence of the operational definition of warfare. Now, a very different approach is to view war also as primarily a matter of social organization, but to place a greater emphasis on issues of identity rather than practice. Anthropologist Raymond C. Kelly catalogues a handful of warless societies. He notes that these societies can be very violent internally, with endemic wife-beating and revenge murders being rampant, for instance, so that peacefulness and warlessness are not synonymous. This observation emphasizes the socially constructed nature of warfare among the various forms of human violence. In Kelly's view, warfare has several characteristics, some of which we have reviewed already: the collective application of violence, communal sanction, or advanced planning. But the truly key element in his view is what he calls, and this is a bit of a mouthful, he calls the calculus of social substitutability. This is a mindset in which any member of a rival community, not just a particular malefactor or his relatives, is seen as a legitimate target. The calculus is facilitated by a segmental social organization, that is, a society whose members enjoy a variety of nested identities beyond their immediate families. So they are members of families, clans, tribes, villages, regions, states, nations, and so on. This situation provides a wider menu of options for the calculus of social substitutability to choose from, and so it facilitates war. You have more options for categorizing people and therefore more reasons to attack them, more choices available. In contrast, warless societies are nearly always unsegmented in organization. That is, their members have little or no identity beyond the family or the clan. Unsegmented societies are also usually small scale, where most people know everyone else, and there is little or no scope for the calculus to operate, and so most conflicts are resolved non-violently. Even if violence is employed, it will be targeted at a particular malefactor, rather than at an opposing collective. Warfare is unlikely to arise in such a social context. Like Turney High, Kelly cites primitive wars and warriors as examples, but he considers these conflicts to be genuine wars since the calculus of social substitutability is in effect. Among the Yanomamo, for instance, once matters escalate to the raid or the dastardly trick, all members of an offending collective are targeted. In Kelly's model, once that line has been crossed, we are in the province of war. On this view, then, warfare is ultimately a social attitude rooted in identity rather than a particular set of procedures. It should be noted that on Kelly's model, the shooting of a Crip gang member by a Blood gang member in Los Angeles would constitute a form of warfare, because the Crip has been targeted merely for being a Crip, not because he has done anything specifically wrong to his murderer. So these are two ways of defining war, as a set of procedures or as a state of mind. As we shall examine in more detail in the next lecture, which definition one adopts greatly affects where in the past the origins of warfare can be located. We end with a look at the Maring people of New Guinea, who were observed in the 1960s. Similarly to the Yanomamo, the Maring had a hierarchy of conflicts. First came the nothing fight, so-called, where both sides, numbering in the hundreds or even in the thousands, showed up at an agreed-upon spot on the boundaries between two territories and shot arrows at each other from a distance. There were very few casualties since huge shields protected the combatants. Nothing fights could go on for weeks until one side got bored and no longer turned up. Under certain conditions, nothing fights could escalate into true fights, so-called, and these took place at much closer proximity using stone spears and axes. The bashing went on until everyone got tired and went home, but it then resumed the following day and continued until one side failed to show up. The final level of fighting was raiding and routing, which saw serious invasions of enemy territory and involved the slaughter of men, women and children and the widespread destruction of property. Are Maring wars primitive or true wars? Kelly would say they are true wars, since the calculus of social substitutability is in effect from the get-go. Turney would answer in the negative, since formations are rudimentary and command and control, logistical support and clear objectives are absent. A problem raised by such ethnographic evidence is whether the Maring or any other traditional society display military characteristics that were also displayed by prehistoric peoples. To investigate that point, we next turn our attention to the problem of warfare's origins.